Hello, in this video we're going to talk about managing Active Directory authentication policies and authentication policy silos. So you can see here that we've got a few prerequisites. Make sure we have all of those done. And then the scenario is just going to be we're going to create some of these authentication policies for users, computers, and service accounts, and we'll show you how to modify them, remove them, and a lot of different things. So let's get started with that. So the first thing we have to do is enable dynamic access control, and we enable dynamic access control by setting the policy. So to do that, we can open the group policy management console and then go to the default domain controller's policy. So I will go ahead and do that now. Okay, so now that I am at the group policy management console on my domain controller, I will go over here and just edit the default domain controller's policy section. And now I will go over here to computer configuration, policies, administrative templates, system, and KDC. And then now you can see that we have the setting KDC support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring. So we want to enable this and then choose always provide claims. Okay, and once we do that, we have enabled dynamic access control and we have met all the prerequisites, so we can now continue on. Okay, once we have enabled dynamic access control, we will then need to create some authentication policies. All right, so to do that, we're going to first go over creating some of these authentication policies. And there are a few sections here which may get a little confusing, but there's three different main categories that we can do. We can set authentication policies for computers, users, and service accounts. So we are going to hit each of these individually. But before we can do that, we first have to find the necessary SDDLs. These are strings that represent various accounts in Active Directory. And the first thing we have to do is we need to define the computers that these high privilege users, other computers, and these service accounts will be allowed to authenticate from and to. So you can see there in the comments. And I've created two variables, high privilege computer account auth from and high privilege computer account auth to. Where we going to be assigning authentication policies for the computer called client-prod. They will be authenticating to prod-dc, so the two computer accounts. So to make this easier here, I will go ahead and just add these to my session. And then you can see that, and also want to mention that in this PowerShell ISE window, I have the PowerShell remoting session open to my domain controller. So I'm actually running these directly on my domain controller, but you don't necessarily have to. If you have the remote service administration tools installed, you can run it on there as well. Okay, so the next thing, I need to define the high privilege user accounts that I'm going to be modifying for my authentication policy. So I will go ahead and set this here. And then now you can see that it's just called Mr. CEO, a privileged, high privileged, a special user account. Okay, this is a weird thing that you have to do to get these SDDLs. The commands that we're going to be using require an SDDL to define the computer account. So the easiest way that I found to do that is just create first a dummy text file. So I'm just going to create a dummy text file here. Oh, it already exists. Well, that's fine with me. So, and then once you have the dummy text file, then you use getACL to read that, and then to read the SDDL from that. I know at first it kind of got me, but this is, trust me, this is the easiest way to do it. So what I'm doing here in lines 49 through 52, I'm getting the ACL from that, which is nothing at the moment. And then I'm creating a computer rule. I'm giving the high privilege computer account auth from the client-prod computer account. I'm giving it access to this ACL. So once I do that, then I can read the SDDL property that was created from it. And then once I look at this, now you can see that it's just a big long string. It has the SID in there, so you see S1521237 blah blah blah. And that is the SDDL string that we're going to need. That is for the computer account. And since we need to get the SDDL for the computer account that we're going to be authenticating from, we also need to get the SDDL from the computer that we are going to be authenticating to. So I will go ahead and do the exact same steps here to get the to, and then I can show you what this looks like. And now you can see that it's generally the same string. The SID is just different because it's a different computer account. All right, so now that we have the SDDLs in memory, now I'll go ahead and create the computer authentication account. So I'm going to create 2 accounts for each section. So I'm going to create an audit only and an enforced account for computers, users, and service accounts. So the first one here is computers. So I'm going to create a policy name called Lock It Down Audit Only Computers, and enforced one called Lock It Down Enforced Computers. Then to do that, I use the New-AdAuthenticationPolicy command. And I'm then passing the parameters of computer allowed to authenticate to, and then using that SDDL that we had previously created. And then I'm setting the ticket granting ticket lifetime minutes to 60. So you can see here that this is all I'm doing. I'm setting the parameters here, and then I'm setting the description to audit only policy and enforced policy. All right, so now I can go ahead and create these. All right, man, that already exists. Okay, that's fine. That already exists because I was messing with it earlier. That's completely fine because it's already exists. So next up, once we have that done, we just kind of continue that process. This is essentially the exact same process. And so notice here that I have one for user authentication policies and I have one for service account authentication policies. And I can do the exact same thing through here. It's going to tell me an error that an attempt was made to add to an object to the directory that has a name that already in use because these already exist. That's completely fine. Like I said, you're not going to get that error whenever you create these on your own. And the same thing with service accounts. I will go ahead and just run these here. See if these things, yep, same error, that's fine. So one thing I did want to mention here, notice on the computer section here, and on the parameters hash table, we only have 2 parameters, computer allowed to authenticate to and computer TGT lifetime mins. However, when I go down here to users, now I have 3. I have user allowed to authenticate to, user allowed to authenticate from, because whenever we're creating the computer, those don't actually have a user associated with them. We're just creating the computer account. With the users, we need to define the computers that they are allowed to authenticate to and from. And the same thing with service accounts too. You see the server allowed to authenticate from. So this is the same general principle there. Okay, so once they are all created, we can then use the get-AD-authentication-policy command, and then I'm going to be using a filter, anything that called lock it down, because all of my commands start with lock it down. And when I run that, now you can see that I have an audit only and an enforced policy for each set of accounts, computers, users, and services. Okay, so let's say that I need to change these in some way. To change them, I can simply use set AD authentication policy, and for this instance, I'm setting the lock it down audit only users policy and just changing the description to some description. So it's easy. There's a few different parameters you can use, but that's pretty easy. And then finally, I can then remove it with remove AD authentication policy, and I can just pipe this directly to remove AD authentication policy, and it would work. So let's go ahead and run this. And then now you can see it's going to ask me to prompt. At this time, I don't want to do that because I'm going to be using some of these for the silos that I'm going to be showing. So I'm just going to hit no to all and then let it go. All right, so next up is silos. So first up, we need to learn how to create a silo. So to create a silo, again, we can create audit policy silos for audit only and enforced. I'm defining audit only enforced by the policies that I'm going to be setting on them. What I mean by that is, you can see on line 135, I create the AD authentication policy silos with the new AD authentication policy silo command. And I'm going to be passing a few parameters to that on 129 through 133. You can see that we have computer authentication policy. That requires me to run get AD authentication policy and specify each of the computer services and users audit only policies that we had just created. And then I'm just assigning a description and a name to it. So I'm calling this a audit only authentication policy silo, but there's not necessarily that kind of silo. That's what I'm describing it as because of the policies that I'm assigning to this silo. So I can go ahead and run this and it give me that error, which is completely fine, again, because it is already created. All right, so once we have that one, I can then create an enforced one. And again, exactly the same scenario here, but here it looks like I don't have my description set up. So we'll go enforced, and we'll just change this one to enforced just for fun. All right. So now I can go ahead and run this, and this is the exact same thing, although it's just changing the enforced ones. And you notice that that one does not exist, and we didn't get an error. So that's fine. Okay, so now we've created the silos. So going down here a little bit to working with the silos themselves, we can grant and revoke access to the silos using the grant and revoke AD authentication policy silo access commands. And here I'm just granting and revoking my A. Bertram account, and we can just simply run both of these, and then it will grant and revoke it right back if I wanted to. So I can hit yes, and same thing, it just grants it and revoked my user account to that silo. Next up, same kind of concept before, we can use the set command to change it. I'm going to change the description. And then finally, we can remove it with get AD authentication policy silo. In this case, I am piping it to remove AD authentication policy silo. And since I'm almost done with this video, I will just go ahead and do it. So let's say that I don't want these anymore. I can just pipe these directly to there. And it would have removed all of the authentication policy silos that start with lock it down. However, let's just get crazy here and do all of them. So if I remove the filter, it will actually remove all of them, and because I don't need them anymore. We can do a filter of star, and then it's going to ask me, would you like to remove them? Yes to all, don't care. All right, so now that I'm done with that, I will just go ahead and run these. So now I can just run the policies. Once I have the silos cleaned up, I can clean up all of the policies, and we're done. So we have created some authentication policies, and then we've created some authentication policy silos, and then assigned those policies to the silos, and then removed them. So that should give you a good overview of working with authentication policies in PowerShell. Thanks for watching.